Alright, so we got done looking at the rise and fall of Napoleon, but as all that is going on, there was also another major change happening in the world. This is known as the Industrial Revolution. The goal for this lesson is for you to be able to explain why industrialization began in Britain and how it created new economic power, social tensions, and global competition. So, the real big shift here is from living on farms to working in factories. Before the Industrial Revolution, most things were actually made by hand. Most of what you needed was either made at your own house or small workshops or inside rural villages. There weren't really any massive factories, so to speak. Things were very difficult to make, but industrialization moved production into large, mechanized factories that drastically increased output. That is to say, instead of everyone making things one at a time, industrialization allowed for large scale production of many, many copies of the same thing in a much faster time period. Much the same way the printing press escalated and quickly sped up the ability to make copies of books. The first place to go through industrialization, or the process of going from more rural singular production to mass production in factories, was in Britain. Britain is actually the British Isles here, so you can see it's made up of what today we call England, Wales, Scotland, and Ireland. Well, Ireland wasn't part of this initially. Instead, it was kind of England, Wales, and Scotland, so the main island is where industrialization happened first, and that happens for several reasons. One, there was large supplies of coal and iron available on the island, which was necessary for mass production. There was also a lot of capital or money available from trade and the fact that the British controlled a massive global empire, which allowed them to, well, produce a lot of resources. And really, their government was fairly stable. Yes, they had a civil war, a couple centuries before, but for the most part, it was a pretty stable government, and people had property rights. That is to say that you owned your property, and the government backed you up with that instead of the government coming in and taking your property. And that's pretty important for industrialization. You need to know that if you're going to make a major investment in making a factory, that's not just going to be taken from you by the government. And thanks to their global empire, they had all these expanding markets that they could sell all these products to. So it wasn't just, making things to be sold within the British Isles. They were then being able to ship them out to their colonies and sell them there, which could make them a lot of money. And because they were a global empire, they had access to the global trade networks that we've been talking about this entire course. That meant the excess products they produced, that is, the products that were made beyond what is needed for domestic or local consumption, could be sold on these global trade networks for a massive profit. All of these conditions combined encouraged investment in machines and factories that allowed them to become the first place to industrialize. Before all that could happen, there had to be some changes in the way that food was produced. So, agriculture improvements, we've been talking about this throughout this entire course, that essentially when there are big changes, it is because we find ways to produce more food to allow more people to move off the farms to specialize in other tasks. You won't be surprised to find out that there were massive agriculture improvements going on at this time in England that allowed for increased food production, that allowed for more workers to move into the cities to work in factories. So, as farming became even more efficient, those workers who used to work on farms were freed up and they had to go somewhere. They had to do work, some type of work. And the population was also increasing because of the extra food supply that was available. So, many of these workers who lived in the rural countryside, who for generations their family had just been really just farmers, moved to the cities, and this created a large urban labor force for the factories to use for mass production. At the heart of the Industrial Revolution was new technology that drastically transformed production. So, new inventions dramatically increased productivity in the textile or cloth production industry. So, for most of human civilization, if you wanted cloth for clothing, you had to get a loom and spin it by hand here in order to create the cloth that you could then use for clothing. This process was extremely labor intensive, so you didn't really get a lot of cloth produced. But new machines allowed factories to produce cloth far faster than hand workers. And this was really the beginning of mass mechanization and mass production. So you can see the evolution here of like hand looms to these machines that you had to use basically human power in order to crank to produce the cloth, to the mechanized systems of mass production in factories. We're using now steam engine and steam power rather than human muscle to move the machines to make the cloth. And yes, this is a child working in this factory in the machines. The Industrial Revolution came at a cost, and there was a lot of child labor and a lot of abuse of workers, which we'll get to in a minute. At the heart of the Industrial Revolution that made all this mass production possible was the steam engine. Before the steam engine, anytime you wanted to move something or make something, you had to use human or animal muscle in order to make that happen. What the steam engine did is you took coal and you burned that coal, you lit it on fire. That created heat. The heat boiled water, which then created steam that would then be powering these pistons, which would then be moving the wheel to create kinetic energy. That same system could then be shrunk down, put on a train, and that's how you move the wheels on a train. Steam power is what made factory production possible. It also, miniaturized, as I said, could be put on trains and steamships, which allowed for transportation to go much, much faster. And these factories can now operate anywhere instead of having to be located near rivers in order to use water or wind power. Essentially, steam power made industrial production far more flexible and much more efficient, which allowed it to spread much faster. And the factory system changed how we organized our lives. Instead of having skilled workers who made entire products, right? This cooper, they would make an entire barrel from beginning to end. Every single part of it would be made by a single person. They decided how many barrels they were going to make. They decided how fast they were going to work. It was pretty much up to the person who had that skilled labor. But now with factories, you had mass production, so labor is divided into many repetitive, smaller tasks. So instead of one person creating the entire product from beginning to finish, you only did one simple small part of that process. Here you can see this individual here is making a spoke on a wheel. He's not making the entire wheel, he's only putting one spoke on. And he had to work as fast as the machines told him how he had to work, because there'd be more passed down, because this person's putting on one spoke, then he's putting on the next spoke, and the next person's putting on the next one. So you no longer decided how fast you worked. The machines of the conveyor belt told you how fast you had to move. And the owners of the factories controlled the entire production process instead of the person who had the skilled labor. And if you didn't work fast enough, that's fine. There was a large pool of labor from the surplus population who no longer works on the farms, who can replace you in the factories. This system drastically increased efficiency, but it also reduced worker independence. That is to say, doing things this way allowed them to make more products faster, but each individual worker had less control over their own lives now, because they themselves had become a replaceable part of the industrial machine. Another side effect in the Industrial Revolution was mass urbanization, that is, people moving to the cities and the population of the cities growing drastically. This is because there was now this surplus population no longer needed on the farms, so they moved to the cities to find work in these factories. You can see here along the right-hand side the population growth in just several cities in Great Britain. So we see Manchester in 1800 had about 90,000 people living there. Now in 1870, 70 years later, it was 350,000. In Birmingham, 74,000. 70 years later, 344,000. Glasgow increased population from 77,000 to 522,000 in that 70 years. London itself, from 1800 to 1900, grew in population from 1 million to 6 million people. The city of Manchester, from 90,000 to 500,000 in 100 years. Chicago in the United States grew from 30,000 people in 1850 to over 1 million people in 50 years. That is explosive growth. The population of the United States in general drastically increased because of mass migration from Europe, Asia, South America, and even Canada down into the United States, which greatly grew our population thanks to the influx of immigrants. These cities are actually growing so fast in population that the infrastructure could not keep up with the influx of population. You had mass overcrowding in housing, so way too many people living in way too small spaces. The factories created a lot of pollution, but also because there's so many people crammed together, there is very poor sanitation. The infrastructure for getting rid of all that human waste really wasn't built out, and this of course led to widespread disease. Essentially, life for many industrial workers was extremely difficult and much worse off than they were living in rural farmlands. And of course, this industrialization led to increased class tensions. The wealthy owners of the factories, they generated enormous wealth. All these products were being sold at a profit, and that wealth was not shared equally with the workers. Society became drastically divided between two groups: the industrial middle class, the factory owners, the merchants, the investors, the wealthy upper class of society that built massive mansions for themselves, right? Household names like J.P. Morgan, Vanderbilt, Rockefeller, Carnegie, and Ford, yes, as in Ford Motor Company. Even here in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, you have like the Pabst Mansion from the Pabst Brewing Company. They were living the lives of extremely wealthy aristocrats, essentially nobility of the past, but their wealth wasn't based on ownership of land, it was based on owning capital, the means of production. And the people doing all the work, the working class, the factory laborers, were getting paid very low wages and working in very terrible, harsh working conditions. So they were the ones making the products, producing the wealth, but the wealth wasn't being shared with them because they were interchangeable cogs in the machine, and all the profits went to those on the top. You can see just some images here of the mass factories of women working, doing repetitive tasks, children being sent down to coal mines, working down deep in the mines themselves, or working in the textile factories. And they could pay children less because the justification was, well, the kids don't have families to support, so we can pay them less. These inequalities created growing social tensions as the working class did all the work in the factories but could barely afford to survive, and the industrial middle class provided the money to start the factories but did little of the work and kept most of the profit. This cartoon here on the right kind of shows how a lot of people felt at the time. You had the very, very wealthy people at the top, and they were being held up on the backs of all the workers who are actually doing the work of society. And you can see the water is rising as the workers are going to drown, and the wealthy factory owners were the ones who were being kept safe by the hard work of the working class. This, of course, led to, well, a lot of tension, and that tension and that structural vulnerability is going to lead to people coming up with new ideas to push back against that. Workers began to organize, demanding better working conditions. One of the most common demands of the workers was a shorter workday, as many of them worked from 10 to 14 hours every day. Here from your textbook, you can kind of see what the life of a child laborer was like in 1832. So this is actually the story of a real young man named William Cooper who was working in a textile factory starting at the age of 10. He had a sister who also worked in the same factory. And bear with me as we go through this, because I think this really kind of helps you understand how bad these working conditions were. These kids would have to start work at 5 in the morning. You complain about coming to school with class starting at 7:40 in the morning. These kids had to get up at 4 or 4:30 just to get to their work at 5 a.m. at the age of 10, eating their breakfast as they're running to work. By noon, they were given a 40-minute break for lunch, and this was the only break they would receive all day. And that's if they had the money to bring the food with them for their lunch. By 3 p.m., the children were getting very sleepy because, again, they've been up since 4 a.m. And so in order to keep them working and awake, the adult overseers would sometimes whip them in order to keep them awake and working. By 6 p.m., these kids were getting really, really hungry, and they had to actually eat while they were still working. 9 p.m., that's when William's day would end after a 16-hour work shift at the age of 10 in a factory. His sister would work until 11 p.m., that's an additional 2 hours, and then she had to go back to work at 5 p.m. or 5 a.m. the next morning. This was kind of a typical day of a child laborer in these factories. As workers organized, started forming things called unions, they didn't just demand shorter work days, they actually wanted safer working conditions as well, as a lot of these factories caused frequent injuries. You can see here, this child working in this factory, it doesn't take a huge imagination to see, well, what's going to happen if one of these strings gets wrapped around his leg and pulls him into the machine. And to make sure kids didn't run off or the workers didn't run off, they actually would lock the doors on the workers, and if there was a fire, which can happen when you're working in a textile or cloth factory, that fire is going to spread very fast, and with the doors locked, people would burn to death on a regular basis in these places. Not to mention, there were no fire escapes for a lot of these places because there's no government regulations requiring them to have them, and well, they were expensive to add. They also wanted higher wages, as many families still lived in poverty despite working these 10, 14, 16-hour days. Many of these workers actually had to rent homes from the very people who owned their factories, and so the people who owned the homes and owned the factories would charge a high rent but pay people very low wages, squeezing people out. It is ironic that even today in the year 2026, this image right here of a worker being squeezed between low wages and high rent is so relatable to the vast majority of people in this country today. One of their other demands was the right to organize unions, that is, collective action groups that they could use to bargain with the factory owners for better working conditions and higher wages. Now, down the street from the school you're going to, Cudahy High School, you'll find South Shore Park. And at South Shore Park, there is a beer garden there. And on there, you can see this mural painted, which is dedicated to the labor movement in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, in this region, where the unions were demanding a very simple thing: 8 hours for working, 8 hours for recreation, and 8 hours of rest. That was their demand, right? We just want to be able to live our lives and work reasonable hours and still earn enough to support our families and live. The factory owners who had all the power in the situation reacted rather violently to this idea that workers were trying to organize unions and gain some power and some self respect in their working conditions. As a result, the factory owners hired this group called the Pinkertons, who actually came out with guns and would just start shooting at people who were on strike for refusing to work for low wages. So, with all of this going on, industrialized societies like the United States, Britain, and Germany and France, they started a debate about how governments should respond to these problems. In the United States, a lot of these ideas were voiced by a presidential candidate named Eugene Debs, who ran for president as a socialist and actually ran for president from prison, as he was imprisoned for a lot of his union organizing activities. So the Industrial Revolution, it really starts here in the British Isles, but it quickly spreads to Belgium, Germany, France, and the United States. These red areas you can see are the kind of hotspots of industrialization around the year 1850. And here's the thing, industrial power began to determine which nations became the most powerful states in the world. Those who industrialized early had a jump start in this arms race and had the ability to gain a lot more wealth and a lot more power earlier on, and they began to dominate the rest of the world. But these factories, they need enormous supplies of raw materials. So the industrialized nation, they needed resources like coal to fuel their steam engines. This map here shows you where you can find abundant amounts of coal. You notice Russia has a vast reserve of it. Australia, a British colony, you see some down here in France, some over here in China, in East Asia. The United States has some reserves. So you kind of see why some of these countries, like the United States, start spreading west, and why Europe starts trying to colonize China, Australia, and Africa. These industrial factories also need iron and steel to make machines, railroads, and weapons, and again, look at the map, you can see who has these resources. They also need cotton for their textile factories and rubber to make industrial machines and transportation. Now, rubber is actually something that has grown, you make it out of trees, and you can see here the red areas are where there's cotton production, right? So you can see slavery, kind of a big thing in the United States, cotton picking, and then you can see here these green, this is where you're going to find rubber production, right? Africa is a huge spot of rubber production, also here in the East Indies. And of course, these machines run on oil, and you can see all the countries that have oil production. And if you overlay all these maps, you can kind of see where Europeans are going to start going in order to extract these resources to run their factories. The need for these resources really drove a new age of imperialism, but it wasn't just the resources, because the industrial countries also needed large markets to sell their manufactured goods to. And Africa and Asia had large populations of people they could sell to. So this created a very strong incentive to control territory overseas, which again leads to this age of imperialism. So as industrialization spread to countries like France, Italy, Germany, Great Britain, the United States, and Russia, they needed raw materials, new markets, strategic territory for control of other areas, and global influence. This industrial competition helped drive European imperialism, including what we're going to look at next, the scramble for Africa. So you can see here on this map, these gray areas are countries that have industrialized by 1872. Now, these reddish, orangish areas are areas that have already been colonized by Europe by 1865. The green areas are the areas that are going to see massive new colonization between 1866 and 1914. This is the new age of imperialism. But as industrialization is reshaping the world, it's creating powerful industrial economies, large urban working classes that are very upset, new political ideas about reform and labor rights, and industrial power is going to increase competition between nations that will eventually contribute to imperial expansion, as I've kept saying, global rivalries between these global empires, and eventually the First World War. So all these problems are going to lead to a new way of thinking, just like we saw the scientific revolution led to a new way of understanding the world, enlightenment led to a new way of understanding governments. Well, now we're going to see new ideas such as capitalism, communism, and socialism trying to reframe the way we look at economies in the world. Now, I'm not going to spend time talking about this slide, but you might want to pause and kind of read this over for yourself, as this really kind of does sum up everything we're talking about, and this is really good information to know for the test. But in the meantime, that's it. I know this was a longer one. Take a moment, rewrite that goal. There's at least 3 important things you can write about, and write that one question for me. All right, I'll see you in class.